Hello, everyone. I'm here with BlitheringGenius, who has a great YouTube channel. He's been on for, 4 years?
Yeah, it's been a long time, maybe five now. Very long time.
hmm Uh, Very big brain stuff on that channel. Worth checking out if you haven't already. But we wanted to talk about atheism, and he just had a conversation with a theist. I think he was Orthodox, kind of in the vein of Jay Dyer, about that theistic conception and that guy. What was his name again?
Well, he wanted to be more or less anonymous,
Okay,
so I didn't give him a name. I didn't refer to him by name. He doesn't have any
we'll just call him the
like
theist. So the
significant online presence. So
Gotcha. Well, that theist used this kind of transcendental argument, saying that you need this ultimate metaphysical grounding of truth in God in order to have a coherent worldview. And I don't really agree with that. I think that you're kind of fallibilist, probabilistic, we're building a best fit model is tenable. It's a pragmatic kind of approach to epistemology, and I respect that. But I kind of want to ask some questions to you regarding like why you go to atheism just concerning those basic metaphysical propositions. Now, first of all, do you think that questions pertaining to the ultimate ground of being, like why is there something rather than nothing, do you think it's possible to talk sensibly about those issues, or is this something that we just have no right to talk about?
I think we have a right to talk about anything. I think it makes sense to ask the questions, but I think when you ask a question, you have to consider how could you possibly answer the question, right? And if the question is something like, why is there something instead of nothing? I don't know any way to answer that question other than, well, by assumption, right? Which isn't really an answer. So unless I can imagine a way to answer the question, then I would say that that question can be sort of ruled like not off limits, but it can be ruled unanswerable and thus kind of vacuous, right? I would say that's an empirically vacuous question because there's no way to get to a frame in which you can answer the question.
Right. Now, it may be that that question leads to explanations for things like the laws of physics as we know them. I mean, speculations about the multiverse as a solution to the fine tuning of the physical constants. That would be an example of kind of a conceptual use for this line of metaphysical questioning. But yeah, of course, it's not empirically testable. Nevertheless, do you think if it helps you build a better theoretic model, that it's worth looking into this just for the sake of like ultimate grounding for why you believe the universe is the way it is?
Well, if you can use something to build a model that does have explanatory power, and that construct is necessary to provide some aspect of that explanatory power, then I would say that it's not empirically vacuous, and so you have an inductive justification for using it. But I don't think something like the multiverse idea fits that description because it seems to me that multiverse concept is more of it's more of a way of making quantum physics palatable to the human mind, and rather than just saying we don't know, we don't really understand this, which I think is the more honest way to look at quantum physics. That it has some paradoxes. It doesn't really fit our intuitions about causality, time, and space, and it seems to work in certain contexts, but it isn't intuitive, and it just contains these paradoxes and things we don't understand. And I don't think the multiverse solves any of that. I think it's just an ad hoc assumption that is tacked on after the fact to make the theory seem less paradoxical, I guess, even though to me, it's still paradoxical. So yeah, I guess any of those types of assumptions or constructs, unless they actually do empirical work, I would say it's better to just exclude them.
Yeah, that's kind of what I suspected.
And the multiverse is an example.
I kind of suspected you would lean that way. Well, how do you address fine-tuning then, given that you exclude that kind of explanation?
You mean like why are the constants the way they are? Or like, well, why is our model of physics left with this residual of
put out models saying where if you tweaked like the force of gravity or the different fundamental forces just a little bit, then stars wouldn't form, life wouldn't form. We have a universe with life, and it seems like all of the constants need to be very specific for life to emerge. And when we kind of run hypothetical simulations of what the universe would look like, when we build models of those, it seems like the vast majority of settings for these universal constants don't produce a universe where biological life would have a chance to evolve.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure. Well, I don't think there is an explanation for why the constants of nature are the way they are. There's a kind of explanation, which is the anthropic principle, which is that if they weren't, such that life could exist, then we wouldn't be here to ask the question. That's not really an explanation, but it's a kind of explanation, right? It says that built into the perspective of an intelligent being, there is this, kind of logical or existential necessity that the conditions are such that the being can exist. Now, why that our models of physics are the way they are? Why are they these abstract theoretical models with a bunch of details left out, like initial constants and stuff like that? That could be the way we're modeling it, and not really.
1 second. The
way it is, right?
The stream went offline, and that's.
Oh, okay.
It's a shame. I don't know what happened. I didn't hit anything.
Well, it might be that your internet connection is
inconsistent.
Too weak or too something, because your voice was breaking up when the stream was on. But if you want, we can just keep recording, and then I can give you the recording, and then you can post it.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep trying to stream anyway, and I'm going to plug in the Ethernet. So, just.
Oh, you're using wireless? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I have a good router, though. It's a very good router. That's what I use for the streams with Ken. So, anyway, what you were talking about, the anthropic principle being a kind of explanation or an addressing of the fine-tuning question, like that's what leads people to point to the multiverse, because if it's the case, naturally it's the case that we exist in a universe in which life could exist. We wouldn't exist anywhere else. But if you're kind of invoking the notion of many possible ways in which the universe could be, and it doesn't really solve the fine-tuning issue at all unless you posit that there's this vast number of them out there, and of course one of them is going to fit life because it must, right?
Yeah, I know. I understand the point that if you posit that there are many possible universes, I don't think that explains it, but that just adds to the anthropic principle in a way, right? Like it says that our universe is special because we're in it, in a sense, right? But I guess either, well, let me put it this way. No matter what, this could be built into the perspective of the being that is modeling the world and not the world itself, right? And so one way it could be built into the perspective of the being is with this multiverse idea that there are many different universes, but we can only be in the ones that have these values for the constants, right? That's an example of a perspective-dependent aspect of the model, right? That it might be like for any model, the properties of the model may be determined by the modeler, and not what the model represents, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible that there are all these different universes, and we are in one that, of course, happens to have these parameters just right for life. But another possibility is that those parameters are kind of like the epicycles in the Ptolemaic model of the solar system, that we just haven't modeled it well enough to get rid of that, those details, right? That's like leftover information that doesn't fit into our model. And maybe with a better model, or maybe with a better brain, or a different kind of brain, we could actually get rid of all those details, right? Because in the Ptolemaic model, you have all these ad hoc things. The planets move backwards sometimes and forward and yada, yada, right? In the Copernican model, you don't need that because you change the way the model works, and all of that detail disappears. Now, if we were coming at that, understanding the solar system from without having the Copernican model to understand it, there would appear to be all this leftover stuff, all this unexplained stuff, right? But once we shift to that new model, all of the unexplained details disappear. So you can't just assume that the model is reality, or that the reason why there is these residual parameters or whatever, these fine-tuned constants, that's because we're in a very special universe or something like that. It could be that we're just modeling it in such a way that that's what we're left over with, right? The model cannot fully capture what is going on, and so there's this residuum of
the constants, whereas
these
really
details.
The constants would
the constants are the residuals of the model, essentially, right?
It's possible, but it seems like reducing that down, or extrapolating that line of thinking, you kind of get to ultimate metaphysical principles. How is it that conflicting forces emerge? How is it that energy emerges? And it would seem that there's no empirical solution to those questions. You kind of have to move from inductive reasoning to deductive reasoning, which kind of, the multiverse does explain, or at least an infinite universe does explain the presence of this universe deductively by saying all things exist, therefore, and I am a thing, therefore I must exist. All things must exist. This exists, therefore this must exist. Like, it's deductively proving it. So
well, it doesn't really like reduce the complexity of what you're observing. So I wouldn't say it explains anything. It just says that some of these unexplained things are just aspects of a perspective, right? So that it's just that it's saying that these constant values are not built into the universe. But they're built into our universe, but they're not like something fundamental about reality. We're just down one path in which they have certain values, right? That doesn't actually explain them any more than the anthropic principle does. I mean, I understand it's kind of a neater solution in a way, right? Because it gets rid of them at a higher level in the model, right? So basically your model is, well, really they're just these laws, and then you have every possible value of these things. So you get rid of them by saying that they take every possible value, but we're just in one universe that has one set of values. But it doesn't get rid, like, it doesn't actually explain. It doesn't explain them in the sense that it rained yesterday explains why the grass is wet today, right? That's a different kind of explanation. It still leaves them, I don't know how to put it.
Well,
it's still
different.
Not giving us any information about the world we're in, right? It's just,
it doesn't give us causal information, so it can't answer that kind of why question, but it would address a more fundamental ontological question where we have, physical constants, laws of nature, notions of logic. Where do these come from? Right? And it's not a causal question. You're not going to explain the nature of them or how they came to be by analogy to causal processes, because this is a fundamentally different kind of question. It's an ontological one. And so, like, positing, this is
Ye-
what the Platonists
well,
would posit, or perennialists, where there's one unlimited um, being, beyond being, perhaps beyond one and many, beyond all the particularity, and inescapably out of this flows all particularity. So it's not an explanation in the sense that you can really build a systematic model of how this happens. Although the Gnostics and people back in the day, and the Kabbalists, like, draw out their models for spinning particularity out of generic being, I suppose. But like this level of metaphysical analysis, I know doesn't have a lot of appeal to you because it doesn't address things in terms of like predictive validity or simplifying what we experience somehow. It's not your kind of explanation, but it is an ontological grounding. It's positing an ontological ground. How do you explain particularity? Well, some fundamental oneness that's not particular in any delimited way, something that's infinite, not limited in any particular way. That's some kind of an explanation.
Yeah, well, I understand what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, going from there to God is a pretty big leap, but I understand what you're saying about the notion that you can have this simpler system by saying that what we're experiencing is just like one particularity out of this much larger unity, right? So there's a higher level that is simpler, and we're in this one specific thing. Now, of course, I don't think that really explains anything, because it doesn't explain like why we have all these universes anyway. Like, let's take the multiverse model. It doesn't explain why we would have the multiverse, and it doesn't explain the fundamental laws that generate all of these particular universes, right? So
no, the multiverse
yeah, you're right.
itself, or rather, like the many worlds interpretation, any of these particular physical theories don't.
You're break.
Am I breaking up again? That's a shame.
You broke up a little bit, yeah, but just start over.
Okay, so none of the particular physical models like the many worlds interpretation or string theory or inflationary Big Bang or whatnot, none of those can address that ultimate reason for the fact of that particular kind of multiverse, but there's a more generic kind which is reality. Fundamentally, what reality is unlimited. And this is more the Eastern conception of God, and that's how you bridge the gap. Like, how do you get from a monad to God? Well, you just kind of accept that divinity is this unlimited ground of being out of which necessarily all follows. But there are ways of kind of narrowing that down, and different systems have different methods. And I'd like to outline some of those. So you ask, like, how do you get to particular kind of theistic conceptions and all the stuff that religious people tend to talk about. But I mean, do you agree though that like it does explain why should there be a multiverse? Well, if you have infinity, you have to. It's a necessary consequence. Then you'd still ask, like, why do you have infinity? And that gets back to the question of why is there something rather than nothing, or really rather why is there everything rather than nothing? And maybe that question is unanswerable, or not addressed by simply positing infinity. But if you posit infinity, you posit the multiverses as a necessary consequence.
Well, what do you mean by if you posit infinity? Like, I mean, I can imagine infinities that don't correspond to the multiverse. And of course, I can imagine I can imagine that our quantum theory is completely bogus. In fact, I think it probably is. So, I mean, I can imagine that our physical laws are just wrong, and we haven't figured it out yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I say
but
infinity,
I can also imagine even within those laws, I can imagine infinities that are not multiverses.
Right, but that would be a less than ultimate kind of infinity. So I mean it like etymologically speaking, not finite. And if you're talking about finite, you're talking about a limit. And this gets to the ultimate metaphysical question of why is form present? Why is form such as it is? And like asking about saying that there is one reality that has a particular nature is saying that there are limits on activity, and these particular limits lead to this particular kind of universe. So the supposition would be that those limits aren't ontologically fundamental, that what is ontologically fundamental is not limited in any form. So it's not like infinite in the sense that the natural number series is infinite, because that's still limited by all of the members of this set are natural numbers. That is a limit itself. So there's this kind of ultimate notion of the infinite.
You're talking about a kind of, well, I mean, then the infinity you're talking about is not really a kind of infinity that we can imagine, right? Because I don't know what it means then to say, I mean, other than the multiverse, but even the multiverse isn't infinite in every possible way, right? It still has the laws that generate all the particular universes.
And all of those,
or whatever, like whatever your model is, it's still a generative model that has limits. It's not everything we can imagine.
Yeah, well, the supposition then would be that the limits of the model are a factor of the modeler and not of the reality that's being modeled. So that, how do we explain limits if you posit this kind of unimaginable ultimate infinity? Well, you're a modeler that establishes those limits, and that's kind of the idealistic aspect, and that's what the Buddhists believe, that's what the Hindus believe, or most of them at least. So that's a very different
But when you say believe,
yep.
But when you say believe, that's a model. So I mean, I don't really understand the meaning of infinity. Like, for example, if you're saying every possible thing, that necessitates the multiverse. I mean, I can give a simple example where that's not the case. One possible thing is there's no multiverse, right? I mean, so you can't ever have every possible thing, sort of self-negating.
If you try to rely on logic, then yeah, you will run into paradoxes, and so the systems that posit this sort of thing end up saying something like the Catholic Church says and the Orthodox Church says, which is the ultimate nature of divinity is not something that the human mind can model. We can't really think about it. You can only talk about it apophatically, so you can only talk about it as it's not this or not that. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely entering into a kind of mystic territory to go down that line, but that's just, there's a kind of explanatory value in it, in that you're saying you're at least trying to get down to, why is there order in the world? What's the grounding of that order? And so you kind of abstract away every layer until you get to something that's fundamentally simple. You can't really abstract beyond that point. And that's the ineffable, the only way to kind of grasp that is by giving up form. Because if it's formless, no formal explanation is going to address it satisfactorily. And I know that that's not satisfying to someone who's seeking to build a model, because this, the answer then for why is there a model in the first place that I would posit is that because the grounding of reality is not limited in the way that models are limited. So there's all sorts of contradictions that make it difficult to talk about it systematically. But I want to move on to like the multiverse in particular, the many worlds interpretation in particular, and just get your input on this, because this argument is what led me into this line of thinking, which is, if, say that you do have many Big Bang systems, or the string theory multiverse, just a very large cosmos. If there's a duplicate of any finite system in that, then that finite system would be in a superposition of two positions in that infinite universe. Like, there are several presuppositions you have to take. One is that a finite identity is finite, which is tautological, but you kind of have to grant that the finite identity stops where its causal interaction stops. So there's not some sort of like ultimate grounding in space-time that's not dependent on the system of interactions that the subject has with its environment. But to me, it seems plausible. This intuitively satisfied me, positing if you have either the many worlds interpretation or string theory or whatever it is, large cosmos, if there are, and physicists do talk about this in the inflationary Big Bang model. They've calculated statistically how far you would have to travel in order to find like an exact duplicate of the Earth. So anyway, if you posit that the duplicates are
Mm.
out there, the status of the identity of any of those finite entities would be amidst a superposition of possible contexts, and that would be a way of integrating that kind of large-scale multiverse with probabilistic effects. Why are probabilistic effects part of our experience? Because in reality, we're kind of probabilistically associated with a variety of possible contexts. Does that make sense?
Well, I think I kind of know what you're saying, but it is pretty mystical for my for my way of looking at the world. Um, I think that okay, so just to go back a little bit to what you were saying before, um, something like the multiverse is a way of tying up some unknowns within an existing model, right? So there was a model that has predictive power. It has some explanatory power, but it also has some paradoxes and loose ends and things like that, right? And then there's also this residuum of constants that are necessary to, make this thing work. And then you can build on top of that a higher level of abstraction that makes those constants go away, right? But that higher level has no explanatory power, no predictive power. It doesn't tell us anything about our experiences. So it is purely in the realm of mysticism, right? We I think we agree on that, right?
I
And
wouldn't say it's purely in the
it's
realm of mysticism because, Everett, Hugh Everett's Many Worlds interpretation, I think he published it in like the late 60s. That solved several problems that weren't addressed by any of the interpretations that were out there. And it was mathematical. It wasn't just him saying, like, oh, well, maybe all the potential states are real somewhere. It's like, no, there's a real theory behind it, and a lot of physicists like it.
well, I'd have to look. I don't know. I'd have to look into it. I mean, the many worlds interpretation is just an interpretation of it's a way of thinking about the quantum mechanical calculations, right? But I'm not a theoretical physicist, so my familiarity with these things is not great. I don't see any way that the multiverse theory could have predictive power beyond just. Well, I don't see that it could have any predictive power at all. Really, the equations and our habits of using them in certain ways are what allow us to predict things.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, a
I
theoretical
don't
model
know.
like this could have predictive power, hypothetically, like a prediction of this, saying we're in between a probabilistic set of possible contexts, would imply that it's not just the small scale, but also the very large scale would actually be probabilistic. And it wasn't clear that we would ever be able to tell that the subatomic world behaved probabilistically, but this model would hypothesize or predict the existence of probabilistic effects at the very largest scales. So that's something that we could test for, might one day be found, right?
Well, I don't think we can test for probabilistic effects. I mean, um, even the use of the term probability in quantum theory is a little bit misleading because probability is just a way of representing uncertainty about outcomes, right? It's just a way of
It's a, oh, it's a
representing
way of representing distribution.
distributions
Yeah,
or
distributions of outcomes that actually are they do fit a concise distribution. That's probability.
right. But the thing that probability doesn't do is like move through space and have interference patterns and all that stuff, right? So the quantum wave function is not probability. They treat it like a probability of an object existing at a certain point in space. That's one way to think about it. I suspect that's just because our brains cannot grasp what's really going on, or we haven't figured it out yet. But to call that probability is a bit of a misnomer, right? Because probability is just numbers that we use to represent uncertainty, and like they don't have interference patterns in space and time, right? So anyway, but uh, that I don't know. I suspect that the theory is just flawed, and maybe it's flawed in a fundamental way, or maybe it's at the limit of what we can understand. That's my guess. It seems like as we seem to have reached certain limits in our physical theory, right? Quantum theory is one of those. And even something like thermodynamics, quantum theory, these things involve subjectivity, they involve causality, they involve, space, time, and energy, and I don't know. I suspect that we just don't have the ability to model these things beyond a certain point, and we're just sort of stuck in what you might think of as like the Ptolemaic view. Like, let's say that our minds were not capable of modeling the solar system in a Copernican way. So we had no choice but to model it as a Ptolemaic system with all kinds of epicycles and things like that. And we might be able to predict it, but the model would still be kind of weird, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No,
I suspect that's where we are.
I get what you're saying. I think, basically you're relying on an intuition that this isn't the solution. Like, there are problems with explaining quantum effects, but it's not like it doesn't work. Like, there's all sorts of technology that uses quantum theory. So I don't know.
Right. Just like the Ptolemaic model is a good way of calculating things. Yeah, exactly.
Sure. But you're like kind of intuiting that this path of looking at, or theoretically framing predictions is probably off, but I'm not really getting a firm reason why. Right? Like, why is it that we shouldn't consider,
because of the paradoxes? And again, I'm not a physicist.
Can you give me an example of the paradox you're talking about?
Well, even the wave-particle duality is a kind of paradox, but also the looping, you have to calculate every, the idea is the particle takes every path between 2 points, and then you have to integrate over all paths to get the answer. And of course, there can be loops in the paths and all kinds of weird things. And they do all kinds of funny math to get rid of that. I don't even it's been a while since I looked into quantum physics.
I don't know if that's a paradox.
And I'm not a physicist, but when I look at it, as a kind of higher level thing, as someone who is not a physicist but is interested in knowledge and models and stuff like that, to me, it just looks kind of like this is a bit of a kludge, right? This just sort of doesn't make sense, and so I think we're missing something. Even in cosmology as well, the theory doesn't work. It's being falsified. So we threw in dark energy and dark matter and all these things. And you could just say, hey, we just don't know. That would be another way of putting it. We're just not sure.
That's not the scientific spirit is building a model and, acting under the temporary assumption that it's right. And then, if it's proven wrong, then abandon it. And if somehow the many worlds was proven wrong, which, granted, it's unfalsifiable, it's not going to happen. But if somehow it was, I would drop it.
Either it's falsifiable in some way, or it's meaningless. I guess that's the point with the many worlds thing. With our modern cosmological theories, they have been falsified in the sense that we had to pretend that there's something else out there to make the equations fit the data, right? So the equations for the expansion of the universe, the redshift and various galaxies and so on, do not fit. Like the implications of the theory do not fit the observed data, and so to make them fit, people posited the existence of dark matter and dark energy. Now, it could be that those things exist. It could be. But it could also be that we just stuck them in there like the epicycles because it's just a kludge, right? It's a way of making the model fit the data.
Yeah.
And as a higher level, from a higher level perspective, not as a physicist, but as somebody looking at, the history of knowledge and how do we think and all that, and coming at it from the perspective of, hey, we're wrong a lot, right? And there are all these pressures to not admit that we're wrong. what's more probable, that we don't really know what's going on, or that, you know, that we're right, and, you know, we're just missing that dark energy thing, or that dark matter thing.
Uh-huh.
I'd say
Well,
the balance of probability from that higher level modeling of models, modeling of science, modeling knowledge, is that we're just wrong. We haven't got the answer quite right yet.
well,
But
sure. But I don't think I'm not so concerned with the particularities of the various versions of the many worlds interpretation of quantum dynamics or whatnot. And from my very limited understanding, they seem to address some of the kind of intuitive problems I would have with the Bromian interpretation or Copenhagen or whatnot. So like I favor that model, but yeah, sure, we probably have problems with it. But that kind of inherent fallibilism of modeling doesn't apply to this meta level question, the metaphysical question, which questions the validity of the model. Because I'm like, in positing the infinite, you're saying that reality isn't out there, and the model attempts to model what is modelable. Reality, like the ultimate reality, is not something that can be modeled because it's not limited. Models attempt to describe limitation that exists in the world. And that's kind of like, how do you know that reality is the kind of thing that can be modeled, like the true nature of what is? Or is that not the question? Is it just like ultimately pragmatic? We kind of like feel ourselves as a will to reproduction and power in an environment, and this strategy of modeling results in particular behaviors like that. That doesn't get into this kind of materialist presupposition that there is an external world, and what we're modeling is an attempt to model like discrete elements. There are discrete forces or discrete elements of matter. So which move do you want to make? Do you want to go full pragmatist and like this is just what leads to like better outcomes subjectively for me, or do you want to go to the right way to look at reality is that it is the kind of thing that could be modeled?
well, I'm not sure that I fully understand the distinction you're making, because I don't think one is pragmatism and the other is I don't know what the other is, but
Materialism. The interpreting empirical data can be done through one of
materialism.
two ways. Like this is coming
Yeah,
from an object out there that has discrete qualities independent of me, or you can look at it where like if I poke this thing this way, I feel this, and always look at it from that kind of results oriented perspective.
well, I think ultimately the only data we have and the only ability to act is subjective, right? It's through our senses and through our muscles. So models are about that, but models are also about reality. So I don't buy this
Well, that's
dichotomy,
that's the
because
presuppos
when
that's your
we
presupposition that models are about reality. Like if you want to define reality in an ultimate
it,
sense, then you simply
well,
don't
they're
know.
about
Say again?
well, I think they're about reality in the sense that they okay. So we use models of objective reality to explain what we experience and to guide action. So my
No, well,
position
that's
is
no,
that,
you're just restating your presupposition. I'm saying it is your fundamental presupposition.
well, no, but you were making this dichotomy between. Uh, I'm trying to understand your dichotomy. It
That
seems like you're saying, on the one, you either assume that the world is such that it can be modeled, or you're approaching it from this pragmatic perspective of you're just modeling the aspects of it that interact with your senses and your muscles.
yeah. So the
But I think those
skepticism.
that I don't think that's a dichotomy. I think those two things are combined.
No, they're
So I'm
different.
rejecting that
They're
dichotomy.
different things. One, the fallibilism in the objective, persistent, external objective reality hypothesis, the fallibilism is at the level of the model in its relationship to the hypothetical entity of the persistent external universe. And like the model can get the external universe wrong. And that's the framework, that's the worldview. I think that's your worldview. But alternatively, you can say that the fallibilism actually goes all the way down to the level of whether or not modeling is occurring. Because modeling, the word itself, implies this persistent external reality. Whereas if you drop that and say, I don't know if I'm modeling anything, all I know is when I do X, Y tends to happen. Therefore, I'm going to pursue X if I want Y. Like, that's pragmatism versus materialism philosophically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, I think when you say get it wrong, though, like what you're calling materialism, the only way you can measure or evaluate the model is by observing or experimenting. So no matter what, it's going to depend on your senses. There's no way to compare the model to reality itself, right? It's incommensurable to whatever it represents. The only way it can be connected to that is through senses and muscles and various extensions of those things. So I still don't really accept the dichotomy here. I think there is just modeling, and it's always pragmatic in the sense that it's about you as a subject, and it's about your affordances, your Umwelt, in a sense, right? But it's also about reality, because it's a relation between subject and object, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by these terms, pragmatism or materialism, but
well, I mean pragmatism as in like the American pragmatists who did talk about this sort of stuff. Like, don't even posit whether reality is materialistic or idealistic. Like, that's theoretical constructs. We can't really address that. All we can deal with are patterns observed, and like just staying at that level and not even attempting to build a theoretical framework at any kind of meta level. That's pragmatism. But
well, I reject that, but I think I might also reject what you might be calling materialism as well, though.
Okay, well, what is your view if it doesn't fit that materialistic framing?
Well, what I'm saying is that there is, okay, so I think that there is order in the world. Reality has order to it. It has chaos. From our perspective, it has chaos. Whether it has intrinsic chaos or not, I don't know.
Yeah. Do you think that you know that for sure? Or do you think that that's like just a presupposition that you use? That reality itself has order?
Well, I mean, when you say, "Do I know it for sure?" It's a model. I don't think it's What I'm giving you now is my model of knowledge, right? So it's not a presupposition. It's more of a meta theory of knowledge itself. I guess you could say there's a presupposition built into our brains that reality is ordered.
Well,
right? Because
the experience
they try to extract order.
I think you do know for sure that experience is ordered because it's kind of like the Cartesian cogito, right? You're thinking, there's processes going on. That's for sure, right? But to extend that onto an external reality, like what the world is outside of my perception of it, is that thing ordered? Because my fundamental presupposition is that ultimately, when it's outside of your perception, it's not ordered. It's this divinity thing, and the ordering is not done from without, it's done from within the model.
Yeah, I don't agree.
Neither one has an empirical advantage, I think. They're just ways of framing the fact of order in experience. Does it come from out there, or does it come from
in here? If order only exists in the model, then how could it predict experience?
Because you can have nested models.
I mean,
you can have models within models. But that gets back into the problem.
I mean, look, your models sometimes work and sometimes don't, right? Like,
say again.
Models sometimes work and they sometimes don't. Like, you can experience surprise and confusion.
Yeah.
Right, and you can change your mind. So those to me are, I guess you could say, empirical evidence or a kind of intuitive awareness that there's a distinction between the model and what it represents. Right, because sometimes the chaos is external. Sometimes you can make the chaos go away by changing the model. right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
I thought that was my grandmother, but it turned out to be somebody else. You know, I made a mistake. Um,
Uh-huh.
that those moments of surprise and confusion, I don't think there's a coherent way of seeing the world, or I don't think there's a coherent worldview that doesn't have a world in it, uh,
Well,
or in which
just
the world
it
doesn't.
would be saying that it's the world is contingent on the subject being in it to delimit it, to like to give definition, um, to where things are or what things are. The question, I mean, it is a valid problem for the idealist. So now we're kind of like materialism versus idealism. For the idealist, like, how is it that we seem to get things wrong about what seems to be a persistent external reality? Well, that would have to do with a discrepancy between one element of what's modeling. So this gets into like pan proto experientialism too, where like there's an organic structure that you can conceive of as material, or you can conceive of it as a network of interrelated information systems, each of which has its own perspective, its own model of the world in a sense. You would say like this atom of helium has a fundamental nucleus and has a model of the world insofar as the world is to that atom like maybe the carbon atom that it's like experiencing some sort of force from, right? And so like the network of all of those put together with all of the organic structure that we are, all of that is based in like modeling locally, but then we have like consciousness, which is kind of on top of that, but is not, it doesn't have exactly the same perspective, right? It's a complicated topic, and I don't know if I can like prove it absolutely, but I don't know.
Okay.
That would be the best contention to raise. I had a discussion with like
Well,
Professor Anton, years ago about this question, and I think I actually addressed it better back then. I think my mind is getting somewhat slower as I get older, but maybe that'll turn
okay.
around.
Well,
Anyway,
yeah, that happens. Well, I've got a few years on you, so I've got more of an excuse.
yeah,
Send me the link to that, and I'll listen to it.
it wasn't a live discussion; it was comments discussion. But
Oh, comments discussion. Okay.
yeah, I mean, do you at least let's shift a little bit, because I'm going to read GM for the
Well,
People says inanimate objects like atoms do not contain models. Intelligent actors create models. Yeah, I mean, I'm using model metaphorically there just to say that what the world is to the atom is forces, is a way of affecting it, right? It's what comes to it, and that's it. It's not like the world as it objectively is. It's a network of
yeah. I mean,
particular
each thing
information
you can
reaching it.
conceive of as having its own little umwelt, or its own little circle of interaction with the world, right? You can draw a box around any part of the world, and you can define what goes into and comes out of that box. That's not exactly. Yeah, I agree with GM for People. That's not really a model, but I know you're using it metaphorically.
Uh-huh. But I mean, do you at
and
least
and
do you
that
see the
that
appeal?
surface is a you could say that surface is a model of the world in a sense, right? Because it's an abstraction of the world, or it's a simplification of the world. It's the world to that atom, or to that mouse, or whatever.
Mhm.
But the brain is something that constructs, like a model that's in the brain. It's not like you can think of our senses and our muscles as being the surface of this box that we're in, but then inside that we construct uh, representations of the outside world that predict what happens on the surface of that box. I guess that's what I would say is the difference.
Yeah, we
Sorry.
predict future experience. I think you can't
Right.
be sure that we predict what's on the outside of the box. We know that we predict future experience, which
Well, I mean, it's the very like this. What I'm thinking of, the surface of the box is our sensory and motor abilities.
yeah,
So what we're predicting is what that's the surface of our mental box, right?
we're predicting the next
And
sense
all of our
input
models,
or whatever the next input is.
yeah, all of our models are about predicting what happens to our senses, and also generating motor outputs, right?
Mm.
That's a good way to think about uh, us as entities is that we're processing information that comes in through the senses, and we're sending it out to the muscles, and everything is about that. But we construct abstractions like China or tree or, hand or whatever, that both interpret what happens on that sensory motor surface and also generate part of that sensory motor surface.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
And beyond that, though, I mean, you're predicting patterns that are going to occur. And I think, did you actually read On Intelligence, the book that I mentioned in the comment?
Yeah, many years ago. It fits fairly well with my own theories that I had before I read it.
He kind of layers materialism on top of it, but like the actual fundamental structure of how this process goes on doesn't imply that the substrate is material that is independent of mind. It may be that it is inherently information in what it is, insofar as there's no it there unless there's something here to perceive the it. Which, let me just ask you about what your intuition is on this question. So one of the reasons I favor idealism or information reductionism is that I can't conceive at all of what dimensionality would be without a subject. Like, how do you have an axis without an origin? How do you have any shape in the world, any structure, without something there to set against it? Something simple, something that's not just another part of the world, something that's simple. A mind, basically.
Well, can you, instead of idealism, can you imagine perspectivism, or just like the idea that you're a subject in an objective reality, and that objective reality interacts with you through that sensory motor surface, and you construct models, and the models are not the same as reality, but they can be used to process information that comes into you through that surface and generate information that goes back out. So there are analogs to reality within that box, but those analogs are not the same as reality. And what they capture about reality are the aspects of it that are relevant to the senses and the muscles, and also the emotions. There has to be a drive within that box, right? Or it's just or it doesn't do anything. So it's all about processing information. That's the way I would think of it. And
I don't have any
I don't think that's idealism, but
no, but it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be materialism either. Like when you're talking about,
well, yeah, I agree. That's why I think it's a false dichotomy. I don't think, I don't find these distinctions all that useful. Idealism, pragmatism, materialism. I really don't get them because I've never thought about it that way.
Which that's why I was saying, would you prefer like the pragmatic interpretation where you're not talking about the ontological status of objects vis-a-vis the subject? Like the phenomenon is there, the patterns are there. We can detect regularities in the way that we formulate patterns and abstractions, and kind of model how this process works. But when we go on to like the metaphysical questions, the ontological questions, what is reality? It's like that the model framework isn't able to address those questions by its nature. Like it can't. You have to recognize that like what's beyond the model is like Kant's noumenon, right? It's just fundamentally something we can't think about, and so you can't say if it's mind dependent, mind independent, any of that, right? Do you recognize that, or do you think that it is possible to bridge that gap?
Well, no, I think that what we do, like what we're doing now, is we're talking about the subject-object relation. And I don't think you can conceptualize the subject without conceptualizing the world. And so we're like modeling ourselves, and we can model ourselves as beings in a larger world, as brains in a skull or whatever.
Right.
And when we're doing that, we're at a meta level modeling both ourselves and the world.
But in all
so
cases,
we are conceiving of,
in all actual cases of modeling, of thinking, world implies subject and subject implies world. Like that's Buddhist codependence of subject and object.
Right. There's no way to. I mean, that's kind of true of all dichotomies, that there has to be a distinction or they're meaningless. Or I mean, that's true of all concepts, that if there isn't some kind of dichotomy or distinction, they don't mean anything.
Right.
So there isn't a subject unless there is an object. And so I think when you're talking about how do we know something, the presupposition is that there is a subject and there is an object, and the subject is trying to understand the object. So that's my model of it.
But
I
it's pretty
also understand
one-sided,
that
isn't it? That's a one-sided model because
sorry, what?
that's a one-sided model. You're saying the subject is attempting to model the object, but what about the dependence of the object upon the subject?
Well, I don't think the rest of the world depends on the subject, except insofar as the subject is part of the world, and except insofar as the subject acts on the world through that sensory motor surface by sending out, information to the muscles. So that's the way I see it. That I don't. Yeah, I think part of the subject-object distinction is that asymmetry, that the objects does not depend on how the subject perceives it.
Well, how do you know?
And
that's kind of the many worlds
confusion,
interpretation,
hence
right?
surprise. Well, surprise, it's confusion. That's why, that's the simplest argument against idealism, I guess. But that's just a consequence of my model. That model is it explains how our brains work, why they do what they do. Not perfectly. It's not like it doesn't. I haven't fleshed it out fully, but it just explains things. That's why I believe in that model, because it explains why we feel surprised, right? It explains that asymmetry, that the world can surprise the hell out of you, but you can't change the world just by imagining it is different. You have to,
that's
act
why
on it.
I tried to highlight the solution to this problem. I really didn't articulate it well enough. Is that what you're calling modeling, higher consciousness, like where our attention resides, basically, that is different than the whole of our bodies, the whole of all of our subconscious contents, like the whole organism, which doesn't have to be material, which could be fundamentally networks of information, not some material structure that's part of a larger material world. I know you don't like the word material, but it's just, for me, the best way to frame this issue. But they're
I don't mind it. I just
yeah,
okay.
They have different centers of perspective, basically, and both act according to, in my view of it, probabilistic effects, where ultimately the physical body is connected into a world that is itself not the future. 1 second from now isn't just one thing, it could be many things. And as we approach it, just like with our modeling of the actual world, we refine it with what's happening more close to that 1 second from now, and so kind of narrow down a set of actions. But the body does it in a way that's integrated with the information of our bodies, integrated with the information of what we take to be a material world. Whereas the model of consciousness, when we're dealing with abstractions, these things aren't, the information of an abstraction is not integrated with like the molecules in a book that's sitting on my desk, right? Like the information of the abstraction is integrated within this kind of like field of consciousness, which seems to be a different kind of information system than the information system, if you want to accept that, of the material world, right? So that's why.
But it's connected through the senses and muscles, though, right? Like you can see the book and you can pick it up, and in those cases, you're having some kind of causal interaction with the book, right?
Yeah, it's connected,
and in a way that is predictable, right?
It's predictable, but not perfectly predictable, because it's fundamentally a different kind of information system, consciousness, compared to this kind of pan-proto-experiential, in my model, network of very low-level structures that are communicating much more basic information. When we're dealing with the high-level abstraction, there's a lot of room for error because it's layers of modeling, and maybe modeling is kind of, in its proper sense, is unique to consciousness. What consciousness does is model, whereas what the rest of reality does is really more of a raw experience. And so there's no room for error because it's not actually dealing with representations. Like modeling deals with a nested set of representations culminating in the material input or the sense input, right? But there's plenty of room for error because if any of those representations calls up the wrong thing and you think it's calling up something else, then your expectation is not going to match the result. So like I think, again, it's actually, I think, genuinely a complex issue to attempt to resolve just talking about it like this. But you don't need an independence of objective reality to account for error, right?
Well, I'm not saying it's independent, but I'm just saying in my model, the relation between objective, the world, let's say, and the self is through the senses and the muscles. So those are the inputs and the outputs. Those are the connections between those things, and then also the fact that the subject corresponds to an object in the world, and so also like if you trip, you fall down. It's not just that you hurt yourself. It's also that it's not just that you feel the pain. You actually, the object that is you gets damaged, right? So that's my model. Now I don't quite know what the difference is between what I'm saying and what you're saying.
The difference is
if what you're saying is that to some extent, by perceiving something a certain way, you create it or you make it the way it is.
The difference is this: it's that probabilistically we collapse an ontological state of reality that's fundamentally not limited. But probabilistically, we're more likely to be in a certain variety of contexts than others, right? And it goes down to the subatomic level, which means macroscopic objects behave very deterministically. But that allows then the difference in the metaphysical perspective is that to say that there's one external reality that we're trying to predict, and it is what it is to say that fundamentally reality in some sense is finite. That there are limits on what reality is and how it behaves. Because to suppose that we're modeling something that's out there is to suppose that it's out there with particular characteristics that we can model. And if you instead say that no, the noumenon reality is this divinity thing, is this unlimited, then like we still get, we're still nested in a particular set of probable contexts by virtue of the relationship of a given finite identity to that infinity. And I've talked before about that, but it's actually very, again, a genuinely difficult question.
Well, I think I mean, I think what you're saying is kind of like with many worlds interpretation, and it's kind of like your reality is sort of, you have your own private world almost, right? Which is selected out of this noumenon that has no discrete or particular worlds, I guess. Is that the way to think about it? But as you go through, but this still, I mean, I guess I just don't understand that model because I don't know what you are then, or how you are constructing this particular world.
Well,
I mean,
you could talk about...
I guess I'm just not clear what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, the supposition is that any finite... Let me just go back to what we started with. So if you posit this absolute unlimited, then any finite thing will exist infinitely many times, right? Or it'll at least be duplicated a bunch, right? We can't exactly speculate about it perfectly, but then the notion is that the body system, the integrated information of the body and what we take to be the material world, going all the way out until like the limits of what we're currently causally interacting with, all of that exists amidst a series of possible contexts. And it's not just like when you turn the corner on this this world that has particular finite characteristics, you're not just going to find anything. Like there's a particular set of like trends that account for. It's again, I did this like several videos on this concept, and it's super tricky to get into, but I will try right now, and I'll try to keep it cogent. So to have a timeline, you have to have a certain kind of equivalency of inputs, so that you like a conservation of energy, basically, where you can account for what's happening in the system. To have a notion of a system, you have to have a timeline where things change in the system. And in order for that, like the anthropic principle explains why that must exist out of this kind of unlimited source of generation. You're going to have that. But given that we're talking about systems that have timelines depend on a certain set of regularities, now we get into this territory where, well, yeah, the next moment isn't just going to be anything, or else the kind of integrity of that timeline will be lost. Because if in the next moment somehow we suppose that I became an altogether different person with altogether different memories, different physical structures, then the timeline wouldn't even exist. We couldn't call it a timeline, right? Because there's nothing there to account for its time-like nature, its linear nature. So that's at the level of the physical body, and the physical universe, where in order for it to be in time, this is all explaining why the physics is the way it is from the anthropic principle and in Unbounded. So that's why
I was just going to say your worldview seems to be all 100% anthropic principle.
Well, I mean, at least it's an explanation,
but then it doesn't,
as opposed to nothing. It's
well, but the anthropic principle doesn't. Well, but hold on. So, like, let's say that a tree falls on your house. I mean, and you go and you look at the tree and you see a beaver chewed around the bottom of it, so it fell down. That's an explanation of what happened, right? And that's a theory about the external world. Something happened to the tree which caused it to fall on your house. That's different from saying, well, in this timeline, the tree fell on my house, or some other timeline in which it didn't, blah, blah, blah. The beaver existed in one, didn't exist in another. There's a billion in which the beaver doesn't exist, and a billion in which he does exist. Right? I mean, I don't see the... It seems to be getting away from the point of modeling, or the notion of modeling, which is to explain and predict.
Yeah. And within the confines of, like, being a human being and planning your life, there's nothing in that context that would seem to pertain to what we actually have to do here. It's just, what is it ontologically that's going on in the nature of reality itself beyond the modeling? So I kind of have my explanation, and it gives an account of why things are there in the first place. Not exactly why they are the way they are, because that particularity, like, there's no particular reason for this particularity, right, except that you are what you are, and that identity is tautologically just given. All identities are produced. So yeah, that's a level of metaphysical speculation that doesn't seem to have pertinence to what we do here. So you can just ignore it if you want, but I'm just going to like bracket here and say this is the distinction between positing divinity and leaving it agnostic and not speculating. Now you go a step further and generally call yourself an atheist, saying that when we talk about the fundamental principle of reality, I don't think that divinity is there, right? And for me, divinity is this unlimited generation, infinite substance, but the implication of that is that it's also your substance, and I could draw that out, but that's the perennialist ethos, and that's, in all sorts of mythology and different systems are built around that idea. It's the essence of Platonism. So that's the God that I believe in, and the reason is that it explains these, or it like provides a theoretical context for these material phenomenon or physical phenomenon. But why should you believe in God? Because it deals with your moral framework. Right? And we had a discussion on morality before. We didn't make it, or I didn't put it up on my channel. I think you left it unlisted or something. But like fundamentally, like if this unlimited exists, then the soul will live on. Experience will live on. And therefore your conduct will be taken knowing that. And so obviously you'll live your life very differently. So it does end up having pragmatic implications. It does affect what we do.
I don't see how that makes any, like, how does that follow? Because if you have this view that everything that could possibly exist exists, why care what happens on this timeline versus another timeline? And every, you know,
because
like
time
in one timeline.
Time is a structure.
Go ahead.
Right? Like a set of related moments of consciousness is a structure in reality, and all of those structures exist, but you're experiencing this one. Like I care what I'm going to experience in a moment because I'm not going to stab my hand. Like I don't want to feel that pain. It's same exact logic saying, like, why should I care, if I live on beyond death? Why should I care what's going to happen to me then? Because for the same reason, I don't want to feel pain.
But at every moment, you're bifurcating. So your future self, you have all these future selves that go down all those paths of causality. Your future self is infinite, so you're going to experience everything, every negative and positive, and all that.
It depends on what you mean by you're going to. In one sense, you already are experiencing all of it, but in another sense, like you are.
Retrospectively, you're only going to experience one path, but when we act, we do so to change the future, right? So.
For us, and
but in your view, there is yourself is infinite in the future.
But it's collapsed. That infinite potential is collapsed by action, which is why morality is central to religion, because what we do narrows the set. Now, like that our action creates a new identity for us, and the scope of what will constitute a coherent timeline, in virtue of that. It narrows to reflect this change, right? And so we're constantly narrowing.
But collapsing is a retrospective notion, right? I mean, it every time something collapses one way, in the many worlds interpretation, every time something collapses on one timeline, it collapses a different way on another one. That's the whole
on
point,
another one,
right?
On another one, not on the same.
Right. But that means, from your perspective, before the collapse, you're going to go down both.
Yeah, that's true. But the collapse in this model is like action is no different than interaction, and interaction is what leads to the quote unquote collapse. And so action is what collapses the wave function. Moral conduct is what collapses the wave function, and therefore, like.
But it doesn't do so except probabilistically. I mean, wave functions. The whole notion of collapsing is they go from this probabilistic thing to a discrete, or from the smear of possibility to a specific outcome. Yeah. And so action doesn't do that. It just happens in some way that only makes sense retrospectively.
Yeah, if you're talking about,
it can't be determined a priori. So
if we're talking about observing physical systems, it happens objectively. If we're talking about objects, but I'm talking about the subject itself. Like this has to deal with ultimately will. Like we experience some kind of volition, and what is that? Well, there's no great scientific argument for it, but there's no argument against it, that maybe what we experience is free will, or will of some kind, is what we observe in objects as the collapse of the wave function.
Well, I don't know. I don't think that's what it is, but I think it's just causality flowing through us. I mean, we are a part of the universe, so part of causality goes through us as subjects. And that part of the causality of the universe that goes through us is free will. And the rest of it is not. The rest of it is what we see as, causality, I guess, or, things that happen rather than that we choose.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. So it's the same thing when
but you're tying it to the collapsing of quantum wave functions or whatever. I'm just saying it's causality, period. It doesn't have anything specifically to do with collapsing quantum wave functions.
No, I think that's what causality always is.
We could just throw away quantum theory entirely, and what I'm saying would still be meaningful. Like it doesn't require quantum theory; it just requires some form of causality. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
I think you're kind of agreeing with me in that what we experience as volition in ourself is what we observe as action in objects. And like feeling like we want to do something is like a represent or a, like analogy to like the feeling that a rock would have in that it wants to fall down. Like it's fundamentally the same thing. That's Schopenhauer's thing. The world is will and representation, and that's the perennialist thing as well. It's just I'm kind of taking it in a different direction because I'm encapsulating that model within this unlimited, within that divinity. And I think at least I don't need you to accept that. You know, I kind of started by asking like why we bracket or bar metaphysical questions, and like I got a good answer for that. But now, like, do you accept my conclusion that those metaphysical questions as to the ultimate nature of reality would have an impact on your anticipation or your model of like the fate of your soul, the nature of like the afterlife, the nature? Because supposing that it just ends is a supposition dependent on this kind of bordered notion of reality. And if you posit another kind of ultimate ontological state, then you get an alternative outcome for that after you die question, right? So that's the relevance of it. Do you get how positing the infinite, positing divinity could lead to a notion of immortality?
Well, what is the notion of immortality? I mean, is it just the continuation of
experience?
I guess I don't. I don't really understand
Okay,
how you jump from immortality to immortality.
That's why I asked, because I was afraid that I wasn't explaining it well enough. Like these, it's not an obvious thing, and so I have a hard time explaining it. But I've done it several times, so hopefully I can try one more time. So timelines depend on like an equivalency of what happens before and after. Otherwise, the temporal structure just isn't there. So timelines are characterized by this. You're part of a timeline. That's the structure, the finite structure that we're witnessing. And if, like, as it continues, what allows for its continuance, how is it going to progress? That depends on this probabilistic surrounding a finite within an infinite. And since it's not dependent on objective limits to what the world is fundamentally, it's depending on just the generation of this, and probabilistically we're going to find next paths. At the very end of life, even if the material body is dying, these systems are becoming less integrated, still that temporal structure, even when it gets to the very simplest levels, is still a temporal structure. And there's no place for it to go away into. The quantum immortality thought experiment, I don't know what modern philosopher invented it, kind of argues this same kind of thing, where if you have a gun activated by a quantum trigger and you pull it infinitely many times, under the many worlds interpretation, there would always be a being that's still standing there. And so experientially, the only thing that's possible is for you to always pull the trigger and it will never fire. So it's basically the quantum immortality thought experiment writ large, saying that at the most fundamental level, experience depends not on particular real material effects, but rather its relationship to possible contexts out of something that's unlimited, and that leads to this immortality. That was my attempt at an explanation, but I think it follows, given an unlimited reality, that you have immortality.
Well, I would say that essentially what that quantum experiment is saying is that you cannot die as a subject, right? Because when you're dead, you're no longer a subject. So if this, in this many worlds thing, every time there's something that could kill you, there's at least one path down which you don't die, I guess, right? With some non-zero probability, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
But a more just general point is that you will not be aware of your death. So at the moment of your death, you cannot die within your subjective experience, right? So there's a kind of anthropic principle or anthropic explanation for why you're alive, right? As well as, it's all that anthropic principle thing where
it has parsimony on
like
its
I've
side.
had
It has one presupposition that the nature of reality is unlimited, and the anthropic principle solves the rest, basically.
Well, it doesn't solve anything. I mean, I don't, and I think the anthropic principle applies no matter what, right? Like, for example, I've been in some pretty dangerous situations. I'm still here. That doesn't mean I will never die. It just means that, well, if I had died, I wouldn't be here to be amazed at the fact that I got out of those situations, right? So,
but given
everyone,
given the many worlds interpretation, though, at that moment, it was inescapable that you were going to be here. Even if your life was in danger in the past, it was inescapable that you being here talking to me right now was going to happen somewhere. So,
yeah, and that's why it sort of seems to take away all the importance of action, actually, like not make it more important, but make it less important. But I mean, I don't buy that whole many worlds view. So that doesn't really
yeah. So
it doesn't really
I'm not great
fit into my world. In my worldview, I'm going to die. My subjectivity will come to an end, but I won't be able to be aware of it. So from my perspective, I will not die. But from the perspective of others, I will die. And my life is finite. And that gives a kind of importance to action that I don't really see in your view, but that's not a reason to adopt one or the other. I'm just saying that.
And so
I don't.
You agree.
It is a difference.
You agree with me that this metaphysical question, which is beyond empirical data, like no finding is going to really settle this. It's just the way that we kind of surround the empirical data that we get. There's no ultimate reason for rejecting one or accepting the other. It's based basically on intuition, whether you accept divinity, unlimited, whatever, or finitude, basically accepting that you're going to die. So, and given that, your life will be lived in very different ways. It has a profound effect on action, which is why I say God is important. When people believe in God, it's not that they don't care about their action. They care a lot because they think that their action is going to lead to a particular future for them. And I think the thing that you're maybe not getting there.
But you're
yeah.
Well, but in your worldview, the action shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter what you do.
No, it matters completely, because no matter what you do, there's going to be a future there for you to experience. And if, like, the future, if I stab myself in the hand, the probability says that to make an integrated timeline, I'm going to be really intensely feeling pain. Right, so the
but there'll be some branch down that thing where you get $1 billion because you stab yourself in the hand, or where the knife didn't go through your hand, or whatever. Like there will be every possible future.
There will be every possible, but it's probabilistically distributed, and so
yeah, I guess.
And so,
well, I don't know. I mean, in that case, you're acting into the future probabilistically, so you're changing the future in a probabilistic way. But there'll be many different perspectives from which you experience that future. I don't know. The whole many worlds thing just doesn't really make any sense to me.
I think that's because it's hard.
First of all,
it's hard to understand. I think, and it's hard to explain. So that's why people don't buy it.
Yeah, but it also doesn't explain anything. It doesn't do anything, really. Like, I'm not even, like, I don't know how you would decide what to do then. Like, you'd have to figure out, okay, I mean, unless you knew the probabilities of all the different effects that were going to happen to you, and if you did know them, so if you knew that, probabilistically on a gajillion times out of a gajillion and one times the bullet's going to go through your brain and you're going to die, then you're not going to pull the trigger. Well, you might as well not even believe in the many worlds theory, because like you might as well just believe that you're in one world and there's some uncertainty about the outcome, but it's not that much in the case of putting a gun to your head and pulling the trigger, right? So how is that model different from the many worlds model in practice? If you're invoking this probabilistic conception of it, then I don't see the difference. And if you're not, then you're experiencing every possible outcome. So then it doesn't seem like it would guide you to action at all.
The difference, well, one is your metaphysical model. So it's not something that's going to result in different predictions necessarily, except insofar as what happens with the death of the physical body. And that's the question. That's what religion is fundamentally seeking to address. And philosophy, arguably.
Well, but when you say with the death of the physical body, that the presupposition of that statement is there is one world in which that event takes place and that it will happen.
Yeah.
That's not the same as the many worlds conception where you know, there are many different timelines and one of them you will still go on living.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very difficult subject. I don't want to keep on emphasizing that point, but there's a high probability that the physical body will die whichever path you're going down, right? Like whichever variety of the future I look at, more likely than not, it's going to be one where the physical body degrades. Because, like, why is that? Because in order to have an integrated timeline, in order to have conscious experience of this particular type, it would have to be a body that dies, because the type of consciousness that we're experiencing is a consciousness informed by mortality, characterized by mortality. That's our nature. It's a mortal nature, not an immortal nature, which would hypothetically be possible. And like, hey, yeah, bodily assumption and the not dying physically would remain a possibility, but that possibility would be predicated on each of your actions. And each new action creates a new identity of the subject in that moment, and that new subject, that new identity, is set against a now a slightly different probability distribution for its future. So it seems like we would have to just be talking past each other if we try to keep going down this route. So I want to kind of draw back and just simplify and say, on the one hand, you can say that reality ultimately, I don't know if it's finite, or if I can say that I'm characterizing what I think is your position. I just don't know. I'm not going to look at that. What I can talk about is what I can predict here in the world, and I'm going to assume that I'm going to die because that's kind of what the model suggests, and I'm going to act in accordance with that. And I'm like, you're kind of barring the possibility of the infinite, which is God. Like, God is the infinite. I think these concepts are the same fundamentally, as I understand them. Alternatively, you say, how do I explain the fact of finitude? And that's what Aristotle kind of talks about with his ontological argument. You go back to, or cosmological argument, I get them confused. But anyway, you go back to like each thing has a cause. You go to something that's fundamentally simple, because complex things have causes. So you want to go back to something simple that's not finite in particular, but universal, ubiquitous, general. And leading to that concept, I get, the notion of the unlimited, and then I deductively draw down the consequences of that to conclusions like immortality, to conclusions like something like karma, or a network of like cause and effect. And I have a probabilistic framework for interpreting that, granted, is hard to explain, but this is the difference in models. And I'm, as I stand, obviously I prefer mine, because I think it gives you reason to live not just according to your own personal interest as a biological body, but the interest of kind of like the universal principles that you live up to. And there's all sorts of creativity, I think, that's latent in that possibility. That's fundamentally like you can pick, and there is total choice of the metaphysical model that you take there, atheism or God. And I prefer God. I don't think that one is necessarily more empirically valid than the other. It really couldn't be, You just have to pick.
Well, I don't know. The way you framed it makes God into something that has no empirical effects or any connection to what we experience. We have no. It's unfalsifiable. So in that sense, yeah. I guess if something is unfalsifiable, to me, it's just an unknown. It's an unknowable, maybe, right?
Yeah.
So I think you could substitute the word unknowable for your conception of God, like the unknown, the unknowable, the what is beyond our models, and that's all it means then. And it doesn't mean what people usually think of God as meaning. It doesn't mean like the Christian God or the Muslim God or whatever. I don't think it means that you could say, well, maybe the Hindu conception of what is it? Not Atman, or the kind of, what's their word for God?
Brahman.
For the Godhead?
Oh, for God. There's Ishvara Koti. That's one word. They have all sorts of different words for things. So I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, so you could make it into something that's like that, where it's this very abstract concept, but that's not what people mean by the word God. And so I don't know. I guess I don't see the point of calling that God. Well, and I don't see how that connects to religious belief in any way.
That's why perennialism is about that. It's how do you connect to this abstract metaphysical system that doesn't seem to have anything to do with religion to the religions that exist. And that's comparative mythology. It's looking at the underlying connections. I've read this stuff, and I think it is describing the system that I'm talking about.
So you're conceiving of religious belief as a kind of metaphor for this other view?
Yeah, there's one true view. I try to express it as best I can, but I probably am not doing it perfectly. But other people have done the same thing, and some people use characters to represent these concepts instead of like a pure generality like the infinite. Like that's a very high level of abstraction. Now, I do want to challenge, like you say, that it's just unknowable. It's empirically unfalsifiable, granted. That doesn't mean that it's unknowable in that we can kind of like functionally like describe effects that this posited entity would have. Like infinite, unlimited means that it's inexhaustible, so producing all things. Like if you define a thing as connected nodes in an information network, then like the infinite is something that contains all of that whatsoever, like unlimited containing and yet not containing. So there are the elements that are unfathomable in the concept, but there are also things that you do conclude, like the fact that everything that's finite is entailed in the infinite. Otherwise, it's not infinite because it violates its own identity at that point. Because if it doesn't contain this particular finite thing, then it's not really infinite because it's bounded by that exclusion. But yeah, so
right, but you're only ever going to intersect a finite subset of that infinite thing, so it is unknowable in the sense that it's beyond your finite experience, right?
Yeah, sure. It's unknowable in that sense. It's only in the same. There are all sorts of things that are unknowable, but we have signs for them. Like imaginary numbers, we have a sign for it, but it's not really like in our experience. We just represent something that we can't really think about.
Imaginary numbers are like kind of a hack. They're a way of representing something which might be better represented as they have two components, so you could just use two numbers, and I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get into imaginary numbers, but anyway, I think they're not unknowable. They're understandable as representations of certain things, like things that have a phase angle and an amplitude, right? So I don't think that's the same kind of thing. I don't see that as an analogy there, because and a complex number is or an imaginary number. I meant complex numbers when I was saying that, but a complex number is a construct that we use to represent something. It's not, so yeah, it's unknowable because it's not empirical because we created it. But that's not the same as what you're positing, right? What you're not saying, well, we just construct this model, this idea, this metaphysical notion to do certain calculations or to represent something that is an experience.
It is to
You're
make
using
certain
it to represent
calculations.
something that's beyond experience.
No,
right?
you use it to make moral calculations. That's the utility of it. And you agree, though, that like
But
one view of reality
Well, I
leads
don't
to a belief in
understand that.
death, one leads to a belief in immortality, and will act differently under these two presuppositions.
I'm not sure I see how that works. I don't know. I don't understand how you go from this view to making moral calculations. I'm still confused by that. Because I just don't get it. Because you would have to know the probability of outcomes when you act, right?
Well,
you're still,
right.
So I don't see any distinction between that and just believing in one world and believing that there are different probabilities of outcomes because your knowledge of the world isn't perfect. Right?
Well,
so I don't see
the difference
how it makes
is
any
in
difference
whether
there.
you die or not. So like the unlimited,
but
I argue
in your world, you're still in your worldview, you still die though. You still believe that down most of your paths you're going to die.
Well, the physical body will degrade in most paths, but that doesn't mean that consciousness is going to end. The argument is that the infinite entails perpetual timelines. The timelines can't end because there's always more. That's the notion of the infinite. So like that's the difference.
Well, that seems like that's more of a problem with them. Okay, I don't get that. I don't see why the timelines never end, or like how consciousness goes on.
Well, that's where you get back to the quantum immortality thought experiment. Like you could posit a timeline ending. What that would mean is not clear because we define the timeline by the experience of it. But I mean, supposing that it did end, yeah, okay, you have another one that picks up right after it. The only thing that you could be is a thing in a timeline. And there's infinitely much out there to be a part of. So like the only thing that you could possibly be is a thing that continues living, and given that it's the possibility of it is out there, it's definitely part of your future.
Yeah. I think this is a paradox that arises because of this notion that perceiving the outcome creates the outcome. Like it's part of the paradox of this view of quantum theory. Which I don't accept. I don't buy into that version of quantum theory, right? That observing it makes it real. I guess you could say
that's a metaphysical.
I don't see why the timeline
theory
couldn't end when your consciousness ends, though. I don't see why the timeline wouldn't end when you no longer observe things, or then no quantum wave functions would collapse or whatever. I don't know.
Well,
it just doesn't make sense to me, and I think that's just one of the many problems with that interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm arguing is a far cry from like quantum mechanics in any respect. But like, I've made the argument for why there must be continuous experience. It's if portions of your future did end, it wouldn't really matter to you. It's like if 50% of my possible futures result in death in 1 second and another 50% result in me continuing to live, I know that my timeline is going to continue. It's guaranteed that it's going to continue. I'm not there to experience me not being there. So the only thing to experience is me keeping on going,
But the catch there is that you bifurcate, or you split down those timelines. So there's not one you or many yous, and that notion that you'll be there in the future down some timeline is independent of what you choose to do. So I don't see how that has any moral implications or implications for action or anything. I mean, I'd have to think through it, but I don't see that it does. And if you go probabilistically, like you were saying, then you have to say, well, probabilistically, I'm going to die down, almost every timeline. Right? So,
but I'm not there to experience those timelines. I only care about the continued experience, not the me not being there. I'm not sure I follow you saying it doesn't have a consequence.
You don't care about the vast
your actions, though.
Sorry, what?
I don't think I followed your skepticism that this had any implications for your actions. I may not just have been listening careful enough, but why do you? Because to
Well,
me, it
okay,
seems. You
so
go ahead. You go first.
let's just take the quantum immortality thought experiment thing. Okay, so you act right now, right? Now, regardless of what you do, like let's say it's taking a knife and stabbing someone. Okay. You believe that regardless of that action, you're going to be immortal down some timeline, and those timelines down which you're immortal are the only ones that matter. Or let's take a different one. Let's say walking off a cliff.
Yeah.
There's a cliff, you could walk off it, but you believe that you're immortal because down, maybe down 99.9999999% of the timelines you die, but the ones you'll be around to experience, the 0.00000, whatever, 1 over a Google of the timelines, you'll be alive because just as you're falling off the cliff, something will happen. I don't know, like a plane will drop a bunch of marshmallows or something, or whatever, or you wake up from a dream or something, right? So it seems to take away the implications for action because it says, well, it doesn't matter if I walk off the cliff.
No,
I'll be alive anyway.
Yeah, but it's not just like, are you going to keep living? That's not the question. Is the life going to be good? Now I know that you disagree on the moral, the possibility of some experience ultimately being better or worse. Like you kind of have this ultimate moral egalitarian view, which I don't. I think that some experiences are better and some are definitely worse. And in the grand scheme, that it's
well, it's not
possible to
really
have different.
moral.
Yeah, I
But
know.
yeah,
Good or
just
bad,
to clarify
pleasant or
for people.
unpleasant, in your view. But given that I don't accept that, I mean, I'm making the calculation.
Well, no. But hold on. I just want to be clear because some people might not understand. I don't think it's irrelevant whether you step off the cliff or not. I mean, I just say I don't think it matters whether you feel pain or not because you're always going to get repaid. Like pain and pleasure always balance out. That doesn't mean that.
Yeah.
I think it doesn't matter if I live or die.
You have an evolutionary kind of view of the world. If you were sterile, you wouldn't really care about walking off the cliff. It wouldn't matter, right?
Well, there's still things I could do for my,
for your relatives,
for my species, for my relatives. Yeah, there'd be things I could still do in the world.
True, but if you were alone in the world and all your relatives were dead, in that case, it wouldn't matter if you walked off the cliff, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. In that case, it wouldn't matter. Yeah.
So yeah, I have a different view.
If there's nothing I could do, like let's say I'm marooned on a planet, and there's no one to mate with, and there's nothing to do. Doesn't mean I would kill myself because psychologically, there's always some slight chance, something might happen. But my estimation of there being any purpose to doing anything would be very low.
Yeah, which the fundamental difference. It's so fundamental in our moral calculus because I do believe that some lives are more pleasurable, some lives are more painful, and that's related to the good and the bad without being exactly the same. I know it's a hard distinction to bring out. Like even with Aristotle,
but we can accept that. Yeah, we can take that as the assumption, premise. Though, and my point I think holds.
Well, the idea, like you ask why don't I jump up or walk off the cliff if I'm going to continue on anyway? Because I don't want to live in pain. Like I don't want to live with broken bones. But then there's this other, so there are many actions where it matters because I don't want to live with the consequences of things that are going to hurt me. Like I don't want to take heroin and then fry my brain. I want to have a good brain so that I can have a good quality of life. I don't want to be in diapers, for the rest of my life and have someone watch after me as I drool. Like I'd rather, I think that one kind of experience is fundamentally just in and of itself, because of its very nature, better. I'm that kind of a moral realist. Some paths are good, some paths are bad. And given that, yeah, it matters. I'm going to have infinite future to reap the consequences of my actions. So my actions matter a lot.
Well, but in some of those futures, the consequences will be different than what you intended. And so, okay, so basically, fine, you don't want to step off the cliff because it might have a negative consequence that isn't death. Okay. And the way you think about that is, well, in some timeline, stepping off the cliff will make me a billionaire. In some other timeline, it will kill me. And there's some number of timelines in which it will make me feel bad, right? So you're going to do some sort of calculus where, on average, or the sum of all these possible destinies is going to be more negative if I step off the cliff than if I don't, right? So that seems to me to just reduce. You can get rid of the many worlds thing and get rid of all that stuff and just say the probability of me in one world, there's one world, and the probability of what's going to happen to me if I step off this cliff is, in most cases bad. So I don't to me, empirically, those two things are the same. I don't see a difference there. I don't see that your model changes
we're circling back
the nature of the decision.
We're circling back again because in my model, if the physical body dies, consciousness continues. There's more life after the death of the physical body.
But that is different from the quantum. That's a slightly different thing from the quantum immortality thought experiment. And I don't. And again,
I know, which is why I said writ large. Like the implications, it's a slightly different argument, but it's based on the same line of thinking. That's why I mentioned it.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll probably should just leave that because I still don't really understand the immortality notion you're working with as distinct from the quantum immortality thought experiment.
It's in my channel. You can go and look at scientific basis for reincarnation, and that's kind of like what I believe in reincarnation, basically, when we're talking about this. And it's a very straightforward notion that like the finite thing that you are as consciousness, as you die, gets simpler and simpler, right? If it's going to go to zero, if you suppose actual death, permanent end, then it's going to get smaller and smaller until it's a very, very simple thing. And my argument is that when it's a very, very simple thing, the number of possible contexts for it are larger, because really complex things only fit into a certain relatively narrow band of possibilities, whereas very simple things fit in all sorts of different circumstances. It's like saying like many computers can run Tetris, but only some computers can run, I don't know, Fortnite. Do you understand?
Okay. But I mean, a computer can be thrown out the window and not run anything. And I don't know. I guess I still don't understand. I don't know. I don't really understand. I think it doesn't really make sense to me because in my view of the world, the consciousness is something that depends on the brain. It's a process in the brain, and the brain can be destroyed. When the brain is destroyed, the continuity of your consciousness is gone. Your memories are gone. The world goes on without you. But
well, I agree that probably the memories are gone, right? That probably happens, and all the information that was stored in the brain is also removed. But what would persist?
And you're...
Yep. Say again.
Well, okay. Well, I was going to say, and you're like your personality and all that stuff.
Yeah, it would be gone. Which means that the
thing...
what's left, that's the question, is the continuity of experience.
Yeah.
It's the continuity of experience.
Of what?
Of experience. And now you, again, it's just teasing out the implications of the argument that I just said. If as the brain degrades, the conscious experience becomes simpler and simpler. It's a very, very simple thing at a certain point. And when a body is being born, when a brain is forming, the very first experiences, and there must be one, would be very, very simple experiences, right? So my argument is that there's some overlap of potentials. Like certain very simple things have a roughly equal probability distribution of being contextualized in a body coming into existence and one going out of existence.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I guess it doesn't meet my requirements for the notion of continuation of the self, because it doesn't include what to me is the essential aspects of the self, which is the your memories and your personality. So I don't know, maybe and I don't know what continuity of experience really means.
Well, I mean,
because we experience discontinuities of experience when we go to sleep and wake up and stuff like that. So I mean, the continuity of experience is a kind of construct of memory, right? So I don't know.
well,
Anyway, I think we're just.
yeah.
But I probably have to get going now, so we can
should have
talk about
wrapped
this
up a
stuff
while
some
ago.
other time.
It's an interesting topic, and it's a very difficult topic for me to explain because this is just my thinking, that I invented, and in the way that I talk about it. I think it equates to many systems that are out there already. But yeah, it's not transparent. But anyway, I think it's at least like there are two metaphysical fundamental takes that you could take, and there's at least serious philosophical work that goes into like trying to tease out which one is more plausible to you. But before you go, I just want to say if GM is still around, after BlitheringGenius leaves, I want to ask you about why the existence of infinity does not equal the existence of the multiverse necessarily. If you want to explain that, I haven't been reading the chat. But do you have a closing thought? Anything to say?
No, not really. Just it was a good discussion. It was interesting. I wasn't sure what your angle was gonna. Well, I had some idea, but it got pretty metaphysical and abstract. So hopefully, it made some sense to anybody else listening. But I think I understand where you're coming from. There are some things about it I don't fully understand, and obviously we have a different worldviews. But that's cool. It's good to. I don't know. It's good to interact with people who are actually thinking about things and not just fighting for things. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Mostly it seems like people are just fighting for one side or another. That gets kind of old.
Ideas are good, and people should talk about them. So I agree.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well,
All right,
have a
man.
good
Well, it's good talking
rest
to
of
you.
your day, and hopefully we talk soon.
Yep. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. GM. So I don't see the assertion yet. Okay. So the existence of infinity does not mean that every property of everything must be infinite. The length of a blade of grass is finite. Infinity ergo multiverse. I don't think that I'm saying that every property of everything, insofar as it's a finite thing, must itself be infinite. Right? What I'm saying is the infinite in general contains every finite thing. But unless you had every finite thing, you wouldn't have something that was actually infinite. So maybe I'm just not seeing eye to eye with you on why it is that you think this is a problem for the notion of the infinite. To me, this entails the multiverse, because if you have something that's fundamentally unlimited, then it can't exclude any possibility, any reality, any finitude that's excluded from this hypothetical reality state, nature of reality that I'm terming infinite. Anything excluded would negate the identity of the thing we're talking about. If we're positing an infinite, then we're saying everything that is conceivable, possible, anything that we can imagine is out there. Because if something we imagined wasn't included in that, it wouldn't be infinite. Yeah, so if the infinite contains every possible thing, then therefore you get the many worlds. Yeah. So he's saying, I can go along with the assumption that the infinite contains every possible thing, but I don't agree that this conception of the infinite is true. Well, I mean, you can't know. This is metaphysical speculation. I rely on parsimony because of the question, like, what accounts for the fundamental constraints on structures in the reality that we experience? What accounts for those constraints? I don't see any reason to boil it down to any finite set of starting axioms. And Aristotle argues that you can't have a set of starting axioms. You can't have some complex entity providing the first cause in his way of explaining it. Now, I don't agree with the Aristotelian formulation of the issue. I think there's a more general formulation kind of waiting to be articulated there. But why do we have the constraints we have? If you want to set a finite set of constraints, then yeah, you're going to reject the infinite. But if you don't want to set a finite set of restraints, then there you go. You have the infinite. And he says, I'm not sure that everything that I can personally conceive of, in quotes, equates to parsimony. Well, yeah, in the implications, it's very broad, but the parsimony is in what is the first principle of anything. And I'm saying there is no one first principle. There's no limited first principle. There's just a lack of any delimitation in the first place. Right? There's a lack of one constraint, one parameter for reality. A lack of parameters is parsimonious because you don't have to explain particular parameters. Phonologically parsimonious because it's the basic high-level abstraction, the idea that is being expressed is very simple. There's not much to it except saying, like, I notice finitude in the things that I observe. Now I question, where do the things that I observe come from? What's their source? Now I'm going to say whatever that is not limited in the way that these things are limited. So saying it's not limited. It's a simple concept. It's parsimonious because I think deductively, once you posit that, the anthropic principle guarantees the rest of everything else. And, obviously you disagree with that. And I haven't convinced most people who I've reached with this theory, this model, because I'm not good at explaining it and because I think it's actually really hard to understand. People acknowledge throughout history it's hard to understand. They had mystery schools for this line of reasoning back in the day, secret cults, Pythagoreans and stuff. It's not for everybody, and luckily the theory accounts for that. Perennialism accounts for that and says, well, yeah, most people can't be perennialists. Therefore, find a religion suitable to yourself that you can actually wrap your head around. But if you can kind of reach beyond and try to understand something that's really not evident at the surface and take things seriously, then perennialism. I'm just going to read his last comment and then I'm going to end this. So again, I wasn't saying that these multiverses couldn't exist, but if, as BlitheringGenius observed, they seem unknowable, we might want to discover ways to observe them or develop other hobbies in this reality. Yeah, so it's not empirically detectable, therefore let's not think of it. Well, I didn't go down this door, but there's a whole other realm of analysis. Yeah, thank you, GM. There's a whole other realm of analysis relating to eidetics and the nature of identity and like the phenomenological approach. And I don't think that's kind of where my mind is right now. I don't think I'm all the way there to fully understand it. But the notion is that there are relationships, there are types, there are real things in consciousness that have real properties that are reproducible, that exist in multiple ways. And analysis of the ways in which structures in the mind relate or could potentially relate, that is phenomenology in essence. The nature of the phenomena that we experience, as relation, as information, that isn't empirical. I mean, it is in a sense, in that it's related to the experience of being a conscious phenomenological being, but it's a different line of reasoning, and I don't want to preclude it from the outset. And if my intuition tells me to go there, I'm going to go there. Anyway, thank you everybody for watching, listening. Thanks again to BlitheringGenius, and yeah, take care. Where's this?